Today I'm going to show you how to knit fisherman's rib. Now this is a super beautiful, stretchy, cushy, bouncy stitch, and it is so gorgeous, so classic. It's also reversible, which is something I love with stitches. Now fisherman's rib looks a lot like 1x1 rib. So these are the same number of cast-on stitches, 25 stitches, 25 stitches, and you can really see how much fisherman's rib spreads out, right, compared to 1x1 rib. 1x1 rib really contracts, whereas fisherman's rib, both the knits and the purls, they're just stretching all the way out, man spreading all over the place, stitch spreading, if you will. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to knit fisherman's rib flat and in the round. If you want this video in written form with the full stitch pattern and step-by-step photo guides, then check out the link in the description for my post on fisherman's rib. So I'm going to start by casting on an odd number of stitches. So I'm going to use just a regular old cast on. I will link my cast on video here if you need a little help on that. If you want to get fancy, you can use the alternating cable cast on, but I find that just a regular cast on works fine. So I'm just using the longtail cast on. All right, so I've got an odd number of stitches that I've cast on. I've got 25 stitches, and now we are ready to roll. So we're going to start with a setup row on our wrong side, and the setup row we only do once, and it goes like this. We're going to do a knit one and bring our yarn up front, and we'll do a purl one. And we'll go all the way back to the beginning and do a knit one and a purl one, and we will repeat that until we get to the last stitch, at which point we'll do a knit one, and that will be our setup row. So we're essentially working 1x1 rib for the setup row, and then after that things get interesting. Okay, so let's work 1x1 rib with a knit one, purl one to the last stitch, and our last stitch we're going to do a knit stitch. See, there we go. All right, so now I've just completed my setup row, and I'm going to turn my needle over to work row one. So this is our right side row, fisherman's rib, and we're going to start with a purl one. So I'm going to bring my yarn up front and just purl that first stitch. Great. All right, so now we're going to do what's called knit into the stitch below. This is really the foundation of fisherman's rib. So basically, when we are knitting, we usually just go into the active stitch, the stitch that's around our left needle, right? That would be this one. But when we're knitting fisherman's rib, we're going to go into the stitch directly underneath the active stitch. So if you think of this stitch on our needle right here, the one that's wrapped around our needle as the active stitch, we're going to go into the stitch right below it. And right below the stitch, you can see there's like a little V shape, right? So we're going to go into that V shape. We're literally going to stab right into it, okay? And we're going to knit into that stitch, right? So the stitch that's on our left needle is untouched. We're knitting into the stitch below. So I'm going to push my needle through and then drop it off the needle. And that is knitting into the stitch below. So let's repeat that. Let's go straight back to the repeat. We're going to bring our yarn up front and purl, bring the yarn to the back, and we'll do the knit into the stitch below. So this is the active stitch that's right around our needle, and we're going to look for the stitch below it, which is this little V shape. And instead of going into the stitch as we normally would when we knit like this, we're instead going to go into the stitch directly below the active stitch, which would be this little V shape here. So I'm going to stab my needle in and just wrap my yarn around and bring the yarn through the stitch below and drop it off the needle. I'm going to bring out bulky weight yarn so that you can see things a little clearer. Knitting into the stitch below means that instead of knitting into this stitch, the active stitch like this, which is what we normally do, instead of doing that, we're going to knit into the stitch below. So that would just be this V shape directly beneath the active stitch. So I'm going to bring my needle into that stitch below, stab it right in between the V shape, right in between the eyes, and then wrap my yarn around as if I was knitting, pull the stitch through that stitch below, and then just drop it off the needle. And that is a knitting into the stitch below. So we'll bring our yarn up front, again, we'll do a purl stitch and then bring our needle into the stitch below. This little V shape right here. Okay, so I'm just stabbing it right through, wrapping my yarn around as if I were knitting, drawing the yarn through, and then just popping it off the needle. Okay, let's do that one more time with the big yarn. We'll do a purl one, and then knit into the stitch below, and that is this little V shape. Stab right in between the V, wrap the yarn around, pull the yarn through and off the needle. And that is knitting into the stitch below. So I'll do that with my worsted weight yarn. We will purl the purl stitch. And now here's my knit stitch. We're not going to knit into it like this. Nope. Instead, we're going to knit into the stitch below. So you can just make out that little V shape. I'm going to stab my needle right in between the V, wrap my yarn around, pull the stitch through, and then off the needle. Okay? And now next on our needle is a purl stitch. So I'm going to purl it, bring the yarn up front, purl that purl stitch, bring the yarn to the back, and now we're going to work the knit into the stitch below. So we're not knitting into the stitch around our needle. We are locating that little V directly beneath that active stitch, and we're just going to stab our right needle in between the V and then wrap our yarn around, pull it through, drop the whole stitch off the needle. Okay, so we're going to do this across the whole row until we get to the last stitch, which we are going to purl. Okay, so here's our last stitch. We're going to bring the yarn up front and purl it. Great, and that is the end of row 1. So we're going to turn our needle over and work row 2. Row 2 is very similar. We're going to start with a knit 1. So let's knit this first stitch, and then we're going to bring our yarn up front. This is where our repeat sequence begins. We're going to do a purl 1, and then we're going to knit into the stitch below. So K1B stands for knit 1 below. So I'm going to just stab my needle in between the V and wrap my yarn around, pull out a stitch, drop it off the needle. I'll do that again with the yarn up front. We're going to purl, bring the yarn to the back, and knit into the stitch below. So let's find the stitch below, and then I'm going to stab my needle in between that little V shape, wrap the yarn around, and pull it through, drop it off the needle, okay? And that's all there is to row 2. We're going to repeat this sequence until we get to the last 2 stitches. Now we're at the last 2 stitches, and I'm going to bring my yarn up front, and I'm going to purl, and the last stitch we're just going to knit. There we go. Beautiful. So that is the first 2 rows of Fisherman's Rib. And now guess what? We're just going to repeat row 1 and row 2 all over again. And that's really all there is to Fisherman's Rib. So we're not going to do the setup row. That is just done. You do that once and never again. We're going to go back to row 1, which is purl 1. Here we go, purl 1. And then knit into the stitch below, right? So here we go. Knitting into the stitch below, and purl and knit into the stitch below. And you would repeat this until you get to the last stitch, at which point you will do a regular old purl. And then you would go on to row 2 and then go back to row 1, row 2, row 1, row 2. That's really all there is to Fisherman's Rib knit flat. Fisherman's Rib is very difficult to unravel and pick up the stitches. If you ever feel a little bit unsure, insert a lifeline into your knitting so that if you need to unravel, you've got that lifeline holding your stitches for you. And I've got a video all about that, which you can check out. So after I finished row 2, I'm back on the right side, and now we're ready to cast off. I prefer casting off in pattern, but you can also use the Italian tubular bind off, which I've made a video on here, for a really clean, invisible finish. It's a little bit complicated because it's a sewn bind off, so I actually prefer just binding off in pattern. So binding off in pattern is really simple. Instead of knitting off our stitches, we're just going to follow the stitches that are on our needle. So for example, this stitch, this first stitch is a purl stitch. So I'm going to purl it, okay? And I'm going to knit the next stitch because it is a knit stitch. So on our bind off row, we're not knitting into the stitch below. We're treating the knits as just regular knit stitches. So I'm going to knit one, and then now I'm going to pop this stitch over the second one, right? Just doing a regular bind off. The next stitch is a purl stitch, so I'm going to purl it, just a regular bind off, except that we are keeping the pattern in Fisherman's Rib. I have a more detailed video on binding off in pattern, but this is basically the gist of it. You're essentially just keeping the pattern as you bind off. And I'm going to bring this last stitch over. Beautiful. And now we're just going to secure this last stitch. All right, so here is our edge from the bind off, and I think it looks great. So here it is, our finished little swatch of Fisherman's Rib knit flat. So we're going to cast on an even number of stitches for Fisherman's Rib in the round. Unlike knitting flat where we cast on odd stitches, knitting in the round requires an even number. I've got my stitch marker here, so I'm just going to pop the stitch marker onto my right needle to mark the beginning and end of the round. So we're going to do a setup round just like when we knit flat. My first stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to stick my needle in and join in the round. Beautiful. So that first stitch is a knit stitch, and then I'm going to bring my yarn up front and do a purl stitch. So we're basically just going to knit one by one rib for this first setup round. We're going to do knit one, purl one across the whole round till we get to the beginning of the round. Okay? So here is my purl stitch, and I'm going to do a knit one and a purl one. So we're near the end of our setup round. There we go. So I'll move my stitch marker over to my right needle, and now we're ready to begin round one. All right, so round one is very similar to knitting flat. We're going to start with a knit one into the stitch below. If you remember from knitting flat, we are not knitting into this stitch right here, this active stitch around our left needle. Instead, we're looking to knit right into the stitch below. Okay, so if we take a look at our first stitch, you can see that there's this little V shape, right? And we're actually going to stab our needle into that, just like this, and knit into that stitch below, pull out a stitch. That is our first stitch. Let's give it a little tug. So next we're going to bring our yarn up front and purl the next stitch. That's easy enough. And then we're going to go right back to knitting into the stitch below. So we're not knitting into this stitch that's wrapped around our needle, so not this one, what we normally do. We're going to look for the stitch below. A stitch just looks like a little V shape, and you can see it right here. So I'm just going to stab my needle right into that V shape and drag a stitch out of it, and then drop it right off the needle. And that is knitting into the stitch below. I'm going to bring my yarn up front and purl the next purl stitch. And now we're going to look for the stitch below. So you can see the little V shape, right? And instead of knitting into the active stitch around our left needle, I'm going to knit into the stitch below. So right here. Knit into the stitch below, drop off the stitch, and purl the next stitch. Here's my last two stitches, knitting into the stitch below and purling, and that is the end of round one. Now I'll move my stitch marker over and let's work round two. So round two is sort of the opposite of round one. We're going to start by knitting one, so we're doing a regular knit stitch. We're not knitting into the stitch below, just knitting as normal. So there's my first knit stitch. And next we're going to do what's called a purl into the stitch below. So we're going to bring our yarn up front as if to purl, but instead of actually purling this next purl stitch like we would normally do like this, we're actually going to go into the stitch below. So here you can see there's a little purl bump, right? So we're just going into the space directly below that purl bump. So here I'm going to insert my right needle just right there. You can see it coming through, right? Right underneath the purl bump. And I'm going to wrap my yarn around as if I were going to purl. So from the back to the front. And then I'm going to just grab a stitch through and then drop the stitch off. And now I have just purled into the stitch below. And I can kind of just pull the knitting down just to get everything looking right. And we're going to repeat that. We're going to knit the next stitch. So the knit stitch now gets knit. And then here comes our purl stitch. We're going to bring the yarn up front, and we're not going to purl into it like this. Instead, we're going to purl into the stitch below. That's what the P1B stands for. So here's our little bump, our purl stitch, and my right needle is going to go behind the knitting and just kind of insert it right underneath that purl bump. Okay, so here's our purl bump. My needle is going behind the knitting, kind of almost coming in from the back, right? Just coming in right from the back, pushing into the stitch. So you can see here, here's our little purl bump. The needle is right underneath it. And now I'm going to use my yarn to just wrap it around the needle as if I were purling, and just drag a stitch through, drop it off the needle. And that is purling through the back. I'm going to bring out big yarn to demonstrate how to purl one below. So here is our purl stitch, and our yarn is up front. Instead of purling into it as we normally do, we're actually going to take our needle and insert it from the back underneath the bump, and just poke our needle right underneath that bump and purl into the stitch like that, and then just drop it off the needle. Okay, and then bring our yarn to the back and do a regular knit stitch. And then we'll bring our yarn up front, and again, instead of purling into it, we're going to purl into the stitch below. So we're going to actually go from the back of the stitch and go right into the stitch below underneath that purl bump, and then purl into the stitch and just drop it off the needle. Let's try that again. So I'm going to just do a regular knit stitch, and then I'm going to bring my yarn up front, and we're not purling like this. Instead, we're going into the stitch below. So I'm going to go into the back of my knitting and just push my needle in, and then purling into it, and then dragging a stitch out. Okay, then we'll do a knit one and purl into the stitch below. So I'm just sticking my needle in the back, just right behind that purl bump, and purling into the stitch below. Here's my last purl into this stitch below. There we go. All right, so I've just completed round 2, and now you're going to go right back to round 1. So Fisherman's Rib is just repeating rounds 1 and rounds 2 until your knitting is the length that you like. Fisherman's Rib in the round, it can be easy to confuse which round you're on. How am I supposed to know, am I on round 1 or round 2? So the easy way to do this is to actually just read your knitting. So I'm just looking closely at my stitches right now, the ones that I've just knit, and I can see that the purls look extra fluffy. And if I go and investigate a little bit closer, I can see that there is actually 2 strands of yarn around this purl bump. So I can tell that the last round that I did, I purled into the stitch below, because purling or knitting into the stitch below makes that stitch extra big, and I then end up with 2 strands of yarn. Therefore, that means that the round I just knit was a round 2 where we purled into the stitch below. So that means that our next round should be a round 1. So when I'm ready to bind off, I'm going to bind off in pattern. And all that means is we're going to do a 1x1 rib bind off. So I'm going to knit into the first stitch and purl into the second stitch because it's a purl stitch, and then just bring the first stitch over, the first stitch over the second stitch. So we're not knitting all of the stitches as we bind off. We're going to follow the stitch pattern that we have on our needles. So when we're binding off, we are not knitting or purling into the stitch below. We're just going to work a regular old knit and purl. So here's a purl stitch. I'm going to purl into it, and I'm going to bring the first stitch over the second stitch. The next stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to knit it and bring the first stitch over the second stitch. The next stitch is a purl stitch, so I'm going to purl it. We are just following the stitch pattern and binding off. So I have a video that goes into more detail for binding off in a pattern if you need a little bit more instruction. So now our little circular tube is off the needles. I have no idea what this is, maybe a little headband for my dog.
Why you bullying me?
So there you have it, Fisherman's Rib knit flat and in the round. I'm Davina from sheepandstitch.com. Thank you so much for watching. Come visit me for more knitting patterns, tutorials, and other fun stuff. Happy knitting!